Thank you very much for the inspiring conference, and I'm glad I attended. It's one of the most interesting topics around, especially this century. So, to begin, my first question would be, what sort of impact do you think uh, this topic could have in the next 10 to 20 years, and how does that tie into the environmental changes that are occurring at the same time?
That's a really good question to start. I think it's important to think about that as in like the 10 to 20 long-term vision because it's a short-term step towards the long-term. And especially with permaculture, it's a technique that's been utilized. Like I said, it stems from ancient design, and so if you look at some of the food forests, which is basically a designed orchard that has multiple layers of food that's mimicking a natural forest. Some of these have been created 2,000 years ago and are still functioning today. And so with reforestation, this is a way of reforesting an area while encouraging production of a permanent agricultural system. And so techniques were utilized of this type of food forest in Borneo. There's a great TED talk about, I can't remember his name. He basically redesigned a forest that was cut down, and it was orangutan habitat that had been destroyed. And he utilized this design technique to redesign a new forest that now supports 3,000 local inhabitants, and they farm in it all the time and using these natural productive systems. So they don't actually degrade the soil, they're continually building soil. So permaculture provides a skill set and a design framework to apply very long-term goals to a very now immediate kind of problem. So I think it's really important for that immediate to long-term future.
And you also talked about the kind of reforestation that is already taking place and that has taken place in the past 10 to 20 years. But you've underlined that it was done the wrong way, and you've cited an example such as was done. I'm not sure which countries exactly are involved, but we all know that the Nordic countries seems to have an edge on this sort of initiative, such as Sweden, for instance. But you clearly stated in the conference that it was not the best alternative or way or procedure of doing things. Can you recommend, say, steps as to change or regenerate a new way, re-engineering a new way of designing this sort of shall we say, replanting engineering?
Replanting engineering I think is a really important science because right now it's really a technique and it's quite simple. We think, okay, we grow a tree that's beneficial to us, we plant it, and we've done the job. But it's really important when we look at nature, you will never find a single type of tree growing in a huge ecosystem. You never find a monoculture, essentially. Also, you never find a single layer of forest growing in an area as well. So when we look at a forest system, there's actually 7 layers of productivity. There's the canopy trees, which cover out most of the light at the top. We have the subcanopy trees, which grow at the next layer below. Then we have our tall shrubs. Then we have our herbaceous species, our ground covers, and then we have our vines and our tubers that grow underground. So there's always 7 layers of productivity in any natural ecosystem. And so when we design replantations of an area, this type of engineering has to utilize that 7-layer philosophy of nature. And if we don't, there's always going to be some kind of a weed or a non-wanted species that makes its way into our system. So if we want to design productive systems for ourselves, be it for timber or for fruit or nut production or medicinal herbs, it would be important to adhere to those 7 layers of productivity and to focus on utilizing a system that's self-fertile, that's maintaining itself. And so in nature, we have trees that are leguminous, which means they fix nitrogen from the air and release it in the soil. So they're natural systems of fertilization for these forests as well.
How would you perceive permaculture, in the economic, viable sense? Is this something we as a community, we as the individual, or we as a family can achieve, or is this something that needs a large-scale funding? Can governments implement this as well as people? And if we were to take the bigger picture, can we always choose permaculture versus the other sorts of regimens that are in place?
That's a big question. I think it's a very important question, though, because it's important to focus on, first of all, systems that do implement permaculture as a way of life. Right now, it's a technique of design, really, that's based, it's not a technique, sorry, it's a design philosophy that's based off of nature. And so that means it can be scalable to any size or any degree of detail. So that's important because it can be as much as the organization of our government to as much as the plantation or replantation of forests. So it has a broad perspective and a broad application. And if you think about certain nations that are using it as a technique that is economically viable, Australia is a good example. It's not obviously not a perfect example, none are, but in the school systems in Australia, they're teaching this to the children, and the children then have a much more of a value of life and have a much more broadened skill set for when they approach life later on. So they have a better resilience and a better foundation to come from. If we also look at communities around the world and look at them in terms of the economic recession, it's really important to note that communities that had their own food production, communities that had their own community medicinal plantations and things like that to take care of their own needs for production of water and their own medicines, they were much less affected by the economic downturn. And so we need to break free from our dependence on this monoculture of economics. We need to really redesign the way that we design our cities, because that approach is not resilient, and we need to revamp our resilience for the future. One of the key examples of how this can save a society or redesign a society is if you look at Cuba. And in Cuba, they have a fast-forwarded peak oil, because with the embargo and with the collapse of the USSR, they had no resource. And so there was a huge economic downturn, and there was no resources, and with conventional agriculture, the fertilizers, the pesticides, and the herbicides are all based off of oil. So with no oil, they had no food. And so now, using permaculture design techniques, and a team went from Australia into Cuba to teach them some of these basic techniques. And now 90% of all the food requirements of the cities in Cuba is produced in the urban limits. So we can really affect huge change in our societies and empower our citizens to be resilient. And like we said before, once you fill your bellies, it gives your brain a chance to think. So it's important to have these systems be the foundation of the new approach to society, because then and only then can we really truly look at what we can do with our technology, what we can do with our advances in society.